Okay, well, welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing job analysis. In this first lecture, I'm going to cover the definitions of job analysis and the approaches to job analysis. And in the second lecture, I'll talk about some of the ways of assessing job analysis through research, and then also how job analysis can be used for evaluating the value of a job, things like that. Okay, let's move on. So, just as an overview, job analysis is basically the process of defining a job. So in that would be identifying the component tasks or duties that are part of the job, and then assessing the knowledge or skills that are required so that we can figure out what does a person need to know in order to do this job, and or what does a person need to be able to do in order to do this job. This process of analyzing a job is the foundation for almost all the work in IO psychology. Just about everything that an IO psychologist does is first step will be do job analysis, and then we'll move on to whatever else we're going to do. So this is a really, really fundamental component of being an IO psychologist. So we're going to kind of belabor it a little bit, and then in future chapters, we're going to return to it and return to it and return to it. Okay, so the framework for industrial psychology. Okay, the first half of our textbook basically is the industrial side of our textbook, as I defined in chapter 1. So you're going to notice that a lot of these things that we're talking about in this first half of the book, we're going to be talking about things that have to do with selection and training and recruitment and assessing. All of those things are the jobs of the industrial psychologist. So job analysis would be one of those jobs that the industrial psychologist does. So first off, in job analysis, we have to evaluate the job. And the last thing I'm going to talk about in this chapter is actually how job evaluation can lead to determinations about compensation, how much a person should be paid or what kinds of benefits they should receive. Oftentimes flows from, okay, what do you do? And then how valuable is this to the company, or how hard is it for us to get people to be willing to do that thing? Those factors go into determining how much a person should be paid or compensated for doing the job. Another aspect of job analysis is job description. And in job description, we have lots of different bullet points that we're going to hit across this, for sure, first half of our textbook. We have to figure out criteria for describing the job, what's involved in the job. We use job description in our performance appraisal. So if we know what is expected of the employee or the person who's being evaluated, then we can sort of compare what was expected to what they actually produced, right? And so that will help us in performance appraisal. Designing a job or redesigning a job depends on job analysis, describing the job effectively. So as we're possibly going to be hiring somebody into a new role in our company or our organization, we need to know, well, what's going to be involved in that. And then training. We need to know what the job really is so that we can make sure that we're training all the relevant tasks and skills and things that we need the employee to have. Job analysis flows into job specifications, and job description also flows into job specifications. We use job specifications when we're doing work in placement and selection of employees. So you can kind of see that a lot of the things that an IO psychologist does, and for sure an industrial psychologist does, really depend at the root on job analysis. So before we dive in and start really seriously talking about job analysis, let's talk about some of the words we're going to use or that you're going to see in your textbook. So first off, we have element. And you're going to notice that these are normal English words, but we're really specifically tying them to work-related issues. So in this case, the smallest unit of work activity would be an element. So let's imagine that we're going to be trying to do a job analysis of the job of clerk typist. So one element of the job of a clerk typist might be filing papers or typing documents, right? Those would probably be the smallest. Maybe we could even break down typing into literally typing is the smallest element, and then making it into the format of a document is yet a different element. The task, multiple elements combined. See, I think typing a document might technically be a task, not an element, because typing is an element, formatting a document is an element, and then I think typing a document is a task because it takes more than one element. Tasks are activities that are performed to achieve a specific objective. So typing a document has some objective, right? Communication if it's a letter, or a loan application if the document that you're typing is a loan application, right? I mean, it's some specific objective tied to the task. If there's no specific objective tied to the task, then it might not really be work related. So it might be something that you do, but it's not really part of your job, if you know what I mean. There are things that we do that aren't really part of our job. So tasks are activities that are performed to achieve a specific objective. A position is comprised of tasks performed by an individual in an organization. And so in a position, you would probably have multiple tasks, right, that you perform. So the position of clerk typist has filing documents, creating documents, photocopying documents. What else does a clerk typist do? Transmitting documents, right? A position would have a bunch of different tasks that are all expected of a person in that position. And then a job is a collection of positions that are similar enough to one another to share a job title. So I'm giving the example of a position called clerk typist because it's one that I used to occupy when I was working my way through my master's degree. I was a clerk typist for Wells Fargo Bank. I don't know that all people who do what I was doing in that job or in that position had that same title necessarily of clerk typist. I think a lot of different companies might call it something more like maybe just a typist, or maybe they might call it secretary level 3, right? Like a very introductory level secretary or something like that. So the idea is we would want to look for similarities across multiple different places where we would have people performing the same basic sets of tasks, and then that would be a job category, right? So these are our terms that we use in job analysis. Now, there are different approaches to job analysis. Just to give you an overview of the ones I'm going to talk about, there's the job-oriented approach, which is where we describe the various tasks that are performed on the job, and it's very job-specific. The worker-oriented approach is going to be examining broad human behaviors involved in work activities. It's going to have, maybe some physical components, some interpersonal components, maybe some mental factors that are going to go into the worker-oriented approach. And the idea here is that the worker is the center of our analysis. In the first case, in the job-oriented approach, the job is the center of our analysis. And then in this last one, it's a hybrid approach, which has become much more popular recently, where the job and the worker are both analyzed, and we're looking at that interplay between the roles and expectations and then the actual person who's going to be able to bring that to fruition. So let's talk about all three of these approaches in more detail. So the first one is the job-oriented technique. Now, there are different ways to do job analysis from a job-oriented approach. The task inventory approach would be one where task statements are generated by SMEs, and SME is shorthand for subject matter expert. You might have seen this phrase. They use SME a lot in all sorts of different contexts, but basically it means subject matter expert. So in this case, the subject matter is this job, and the expert would oftentimes be maybe somebody who already has the job, or somebody who supervises people who are in that job, something like that. Task statements are going to be rated by incumbents, and an incumbent is a person who is currently occupying the job. So I'm introducing a little bit more terminology as we go along here. So task statements are rated by incumbents on performance. Do I actually do this job? Is this an important part of my job? Is the next phase. So we look at, do I actually do it? How important or critical is this task to the job that I do every day? And then the relative time spent on the job actually performing this task. So you can imagine that things that maybe the supervisor has written down as something that is part of the job. So the supervisor has generated the task statements. And then the actual incumbents who are in the job get to say whether they actually do those things, how much they actually do those things, how much the completion of those things actually matters. I don't mean to be sarcastic, but like the supervisor might think, oh, these are the critical components of the job. And then the person who's actually working the job goes, yeah, I rarely do that. Like I hardly ever have to do that task. Maybe once a month I have to do that or something like that. And so we can kind of, from the combination of what's sort of expected from the subject matter expert, what's expected to be part of the job versus how people who are actually in the job actually accomplish the job. So you get sort of two angles using that task inventory approach. Another job-oriented technique is what's called functional job analysis. When I first started creating all of my slides, I went ahead and used the shorthand that is pretty common out in the work world. They always shorten everything. And so you might be an IO psychologist and you'd say, well, I was out at, Microsoft doing an FJA, and, other IO psychologists would know what you meant because you said FJA. You'll notice as the quarter goes on, I'll stop doing the initialization because I started to realize these don't mean anything unless you're in it and doing it and really like enmeshed. So functional job analysis, this is a really structured way of analyzing the job. And the big thing is that data is going to be collected on what tasks the worker does and then how those tasks are actually performed. So you're going to see that in functional job analysis, you're going to have maybe observers watching a worker do what a worker does, and then rating what is determined to be relevant tasks, tasks that seem to be important and relevant to the accomplishment of the job. They're going to be rated on data, people, and things. So for each job, we're going to be looking at the tasks that are actually performed, and then we're going to be looking at, okay, so what is this task really about? And so if we determine that it's really about data, and by the way, a single task might have a rating on all three of these dimensions, right? So we've got data, which is handling information, handling ideas, handling facts. People, which is, understanding somebody else's perspective, showing courtesy, providing mentoring to somebody, things like that. And then we've got things, which would be strength or speed or coordination that, is required for the accomplishment of the tasks. So we've got these three different components, and you can imagine how a single task might have you're handling information, showing courtesy, and displaying speed, right? Something like you could see how you might have a rating on all three of these different dimensions. So one of the goals of the functional job analysis is really to understand the extent to which these dimensions interact with each other within the job. Some jobs you might have heard being described as people jobs, right? The social sciences are oftentimes described as people jobs because we show understanding of other people and things like that. Some jobs are oftentimes referred to as more data-driven jobs, right? Where they maybe you don't have to put as much emphasis on understanding other people, but instead you're handling a lot of information. Other jobs are oftentimes referred to as a different word than what would be used in this example, but sort of physical jobs, right? That require strength or that require coordination. So you're probably familiar with the idea that different jobs are sort of viewed as having different emphases. What's important about functional job analysis is the assumption that really probably most jobs have tasks that have some degree of representation on all of these different dimensions, all three of these dimensions. And so we want to kind of look at how they interact. And so is it predominantly a people task with a secondary, data component, and maybe a tertiary, or maybe way far behind is the things part? Like maybe people don't mind if you're a little bit slow in your responding, as long as you're courteous and you handle the information really well. Right. So we want to see how these interact to determine really what kind of person really would excel in this job, or what kinds of skills do we really need to train a person to do well in this job. So that's really the purpose of functional job analysis, is to try and match up, like look at these interactions so that we can use that information to improve our existing employees, or recruit the kinds of employees we need. All right. Now, this is an old-fashioned approach to job analysis called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. I pulled this one since this is my occupation: faculty member, college or university. And it's kind of interesting to read the description that they provided, because it says teaches one or more subjects. Interesting random choices they put here, such as economics, chemistry, law, or medicine within prescribed curriculum. Not sure what that means, but okay. Prepares and delivers lectures to students. That sounds right. Compiles bibliographies of specialized materials for outside reading assignments. Yeah. Stimulates class discussions. Well, we hope so. Compiles, administers, and grades examinations, or assigns this work to others. Thank you, TA. Directs research of other teachers or graduate students. I mean, it's actually really pretty specific list of things, right? It was undertaken in the 1930s under the Department of Labor, and they used functional job analysis to develop these descriptions of jobs. The goal is to match people with jobs. When you look through a listing like this, it helps you to figure out whether you have what it takes to be in that field. A lot of it is about, self-reflection, but it's also about like vocational counseling. We could look at, the characteristics of a job, and then interview our client and see if they really have those characteristics, or they feel like they do, or they want to spend their time doing the things that are listed there. The Dictionary of Occupational Titles described about 12,000 jobs. And I was blown away when I first saw that number, because I thought there are 12,000 jobs, different jobs in the world. It's like hard to imagine about 12,000 independent, unique, different jobs, right? Kind of surprising. So you've got to remember, this was created in the 1930s, long before Google, right? So they had to organize the material some fashion so that people could find what they were looking for. So the first thing in the entry you'll see is that number, and it's the occupational code. And then there's a specific title that's always going to be listed at the top. And then it gives you the industry that occupation works within. We've got a lead statement that sort of gives you an overview of what the whole entry is going to be about. And then we've got the task element statements, and then we've got the may terms. You'll notice under may be designated according to faculty rank in traditional hierarchy as determined by institution's estimate of scholarly maturity, as associate professor, or according to rank distinguished by duties assigned or amount of time devoted to academic work, as research assistant, visiting professor. May teach in two-year college and be designated teacher, junior college, or in technical institute and be designed faculty, right? So they get very specific, here's the general description under the task element statements. Here's the general description of what a person in this job category would do. And then in the may terms, they start getting very specific, right? About it could be this or it could be that. It might be like this or it might be like that. So it's a pretty neat little undertaking. You'll notice it occurred in the 1930s. And if you recall back from chapter 1, that was a time when, IO Psych was really blossoming. And you can imagine the man hours that went into, describing 12,000 jobs, right? Our more modern version of that is ONET, which I think is a very unfortunate name, frankly, because it's called Occupational Information Network. But look at the URL I've got linked there at the top of the slide. it looks like one T center. So I think it's a very unfortunately named thing for the internet. Like, it'd be nice if there was some other name for it. Anyway, they call it ONET. And ONET is the newer version of the DOT, and it again was created by the Department of Labor. They've narrowed it down. 12,000 jobs turned out to be probably a few too many. Some probably went out of fashion. Some jobs don't exist that used to exist in the old days, but we've added a bunch of new jobs that didn't used to exist in the old days. So it should have been kind of a trade-off, and we should have still ended up with it, the same number of jobs. But what ONET deliberately did was tried to gather together more jobs that were similar to each other so we could limit the total number of entries. So it identifies and describes key components of modern occupations. And so you see across the top, these are all the characteristics that are worker oriented. So we need worker characteristics, worker requirements, experience requirements. Along the bottom, you see job oriented. So you see the occupational requirements, the occupational characteristics, and then the occupation specific information. And so if you look across from the top row to the bottom row, you see the cross occupation comparisons and the occupation specific comparisons happening, so that you can kind of see how these different careers or jobs line up with each other. So it's based on data gathered using the hybrid approach, where instead of just looking at the job or just looking at the worker, now we're looking at the job and the worker. So you can kind of see the outcome of that, right? Where you're emphasizing worker qualities and job qualities, helping to see the employer or the employee see what factors are similar across occupations and which factors are unique for this occupation. So we can maybe discriminate this occupation from others, things like that. It is modern, so it's on the internet, it's a database, and so it's really accessible. So if you're thinking about certain careers, it's kind of fun to get onto ONET and search those careers, see what might fit your interests, things like that. It's kind of a fun little database to search through. Now, some of the criticisms of the job-oriented techniques are that it's too narrowly focused on tasks. I mean, you could see that that's all they're really focused on. So yeah, pretty interested on tasks. One of the things that may happen is that you could miss the similarity in jobs because you're focusing so closely on, task specificity. You're looking at whether it uses technology to accomplish this task or not. And it's like, if the task is fundamentally the same, does it really matter whether it's done on a computer or it's done on a calculator? I mean, does it really matter? Because you can imagine if it's done on a calculator, it could so easily switch over to a computer, right? So a lot of times they say that, well, if we're going to be looking at technological differences, that could just be a function of this employer or this job category not really having gotten up to speed yet with technology. And once they do, then now these two jobs are going to become the same thing when they start using the same technology. So having so much task specificity can actually give a false impression of differences. Behavioral specificity also. I mean, if you're working for one company, they might want you to do physically, behaviorally the job a certain way. And the truth is, it's not substantively different from how it's being done at another company, but they have a slightly different behavioral, repertoire that they're using. And so, we may think, oh gosh, these are two different jobs, but the truth is, it's stylistic. They really are the same job. So what about worker-oriented techniques? In this view, we're going to take a much greater emphasis on the human characteristics that contribute to successful job performance. And, we're going to look less at what exactly are the tasks and a little bit more at what it takes to be successful in this job. It's going to be a lot more effective for making comparisons across jobs because we're going to start to notice which characteristics seem to be necessary for a lot of different kinds of jobs. So it's kind of informative that way. So the job element method is one way of doing worker-oriented analysis. Job elements are we're going to hear this phrase a lot. KSAOs. KSAO. Knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics required for successful job performance. So you're going to hear the phrase KSAO in other chapters as well, because it's part of job analysis, and it's something that we oftentimes need to quantify. Like, what are the KSAOs that are required for successful job performance? So we directly connect job analysis to selection context through the KSAOs, right? So we have certain knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that we're going to be looking for in selection. So SMEs, right, those subject matter experts, are going to develop a list of job elements and sub-elements, and they're going to provide work examples of each element and sub-element. And that's going to help. So this sounds like tasks again, right? You're like, wait, I thought that we weren't going to be analyzing tasks. The point here is to figure out what knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics would be required in order to complete these elements and sub-elements, right? So it's a slightly different angle. The only reason why we're looking at the tasks or the elements is so that we can figure out what knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics we would want to look for in an applicant. One of the criticisms of this technique is it's like, well, but the tasks are really ignored. We're looking really at the elements that would be combined together to complete a task, but we're just looking at the elements and the sub-elements. Like I gave you the example of the clerk typist earlier. And I mentioned typing would be an element. Well, a sub-element would be moving my fingers across keys, right? Like that's a sub-element. So we're getting very specific when we talk about worker-oriented techniques. But the reason why we would get that specific is because, well, we need somebody who has good, finger mobility. There are certain knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that we're going to want to look for in an employee who's going to be able to successfully complete the job. So the criticism that it ignores specific job tasks is just sort of complaining that you're so busy looking at elements, little tiny bits that combine to make a task, that you're not really giving good credit to the fact that we have to combine those elements to complete an actual task. So I have a strong opinion that probably the people who say, well, you're ignoring the job tasks are probably people who do job-oriented job analysis. So that's my assessment. Now, another way to do a worker-oriented technique is what's called position analysis questionnaire. Now, this is the best known method for analyzing, what the KSAOs that are required for the job. It's a standardized instrument that contains 187 items, and it describes general work behaviors, work conditions, and job characteristics. So in this 187 items, we're going to get a really good image of what the job that we're analyzing really includes as far as behaviors, conditions, and job characteristics. The criticism of this technique is that to complete this standardized instrument, the person who's responding has to have really high level reading. It is written kind of in a complex way, and you have to be able to understand sort of college level language. And we shouldn't always expect people who are even supervisors to have that level of, reading skill. It's not well suited for describing what's involved in a managerial job. So it's not as flexible as maybe we would like. It's really good for hiring people who are beneath managers, not people who are managers or above. And some of the items are too abstract in the way that they're written. And so sometimes respondents either leave them blank or they say, what does this mean? Like, what are you looking for here? And when we administer surveys, we don't want the respondents to actually ask us, what does this mean? We want them to be able to go on their own interpretation of it. And so if they're asking for help, that kind of implies it wasn't written very well, right? It shouldn't be that abstract. So how about the common metric questionnaire? Maybe this will be an improvement. Or maybe not, because look, it has 2,077 items with 80 dimensions. It's a computer-based questionnaire. So it kind of could go faster for people who are good at, using the mouse and clicking and things like that. It could end up going a lot slower. It probably is going to go a lot slower than that 187 items that was on the previous one. The goal of so many items with so many dimensions is to describe work activities using a common set of items written at an abstract level. And remember on the last slide, the complaint was too abstract, right? But we want it to be abstract enough that it could describe lots of different positions. We don't want to get super specific and accidentally be describing a specific job in the questions. The rating scale has the same meaning across all jobs. So if I gave it a 6 rating, and I'm talking about a job that is for a clerk typist, and you're doing the rating scale because you're trying to describe the job of a lawyer in a law firm, your 6 on that scale should mean basically the same thing as my 6 on the clerk typist job. Like it shouldn't matter what kind of job you're in, the ratings should be comparable. One big improvement is that the items on this scale are a lot more behaviorally specific than the 2 abstract questions that were on the previous scale. The reading level is a lot lower so that we can have a variety of people completing the scale without difficulty. It can be applied to managerial jobs as well as the non-managerial, so that's another improvement. So it seems like a better scale altogether, and it is, except for this one giant criticism that it takes about 3 hours to complete. And for a lot of people who are having to complete this because they're trying to be the subject matter expert to help with the job analysis, 3 hours of completing a questionnaire seems like they're not working. You know what I mean? They're like, I could be being productive. I could be supervising my employees. I could be doing other things. And here I am spending 3 hours. And they might break it up into an hour a day for 3 days. And it just seems like, I don't want to do this. And so you can get some pushback from the respondents on this. But if we can encourage them that it's going to give us really, really good information, and hopefully this will be the last time for a really long time that you would have to do this kind of questionnaire, sometimes they're willing to push through it. But it is a huge obstacle to get over, that you're going to say to somebody, okay, so I need you to take this scale so that I can figure out what the job entails, and it's going to take you 3 hours. So that's a huge, huge hurdle. All right. I think I've been talking long enough, so my plan was to stop here and come back in the next section and talk about advances in job analysis and talk a little bit about research, and then we'll get to that compensation issue.